So today we're going to review some very important concepts and put the whole thing in a context so that it becomes really very clear and so on, historically. And today I want to speak about some very important things related to this. We all know that by Avodah was a combination of a neshama and a guf, a spiritual entity and a physical entity. He was a combination of both. But who was actually Avodah? So it's very unclear what it says from the Ramchal and so on and so forth. But fundamentally it seems, because it says, neshama shechazalta bi abchemra, it says, my soul which has been given to me. So it's not from the sentence itself that my soul is not me. That's why it's called my soul. And it refers to the fact that it was given to me and so on. So it's pretty clear from that pasuk, from that statement, that tefillah, that the soul is not me. So the question is, who is me? So if the soul is not me, is the body me? And the answer is no. Because the body, when the soul leaves it, the body becomes died, and the soul and the body is no longer alive. So the fundamental question that you have to ask is, who is the Zulasoi? So it seems to be, and I've said this before, that the Zulasoi is a consciousness behind the body and the soul. The soul is actually a self, which has the ability to be conscious and aware. And that's all he is. What does that look like? We don't really know. No one speaks about that. No one really has any idea what the self looks like or actually how it behaves. But it seems to be that the self is an active awareness, and this is what the Zulasoi is. As an active awareness, this self possesses a body and a soul. So what exactly are these attachments? What is the soul and what is the body? So it seems to be this is a very deep concept, the relationship of the self to the body and the soul, in terms of who the Zulasoi is. The Zulasoi is clearly the self, an active awareness. And the fundamental active awareness is that the self, the Zulasoi, knows itself. It knows itself by itself. And I mentioned this before as a very important principle. The fundamental awareness of the self is that it has knowledge of itself by itself without any other assistance. And what is this knowledge of self? The fact that the knowledge of the self is the fact that the self exists. And this is really what existence is. Existence is not really a process that's attached to an essence, but existence is simply a knowledge that one is, that someone is, you are someone. If I don't call that really existence, I call that a manifestation. The fundamental act of a manifestation is that the self knows that it is, and that's its existence. Existence is not a process which is attached to an essence called the self. Existence fundamentally is a manifestation that the self exists. It exists how? Through its knowledge of itself, and that's what awareness is. It's an act of consciousness where the self knows that it is. So what are the two entities called the soul and the body? Well, these are two fundamental substances that connect to the awareness itself, and they determine the nature of the awareness, not the awareness itself. The awareness is a product of the self, but the nature of its awareness, what it's aware of when it senses itself, is what the soul and the the body is. So the soul of the body is essentially, like I say, it's an active awareness. It's essentially like a lens, like the glasses in a lens. The glasses have two lenses, which allow the eyes to see. And the soul is one type of lens, and the body is another type of lens. And these two lenses convey a completely different image. One lens connects what's called the vision of the body, and the vision of the eyes or the body is multiplicity. It sees all entities not as one thing or part of one thing. It sees all entities fundamentally as entities which are separate. They have different essences. They are different things. So it sees the essence of what the body sees is called multiplicity, or the multiplicity of entities. The soul, however, sees a completely different thing. The soul is not really composed of different limbs or anything. It's one individual piece. And what the soul sees in one way, one shot, it sees the nature of an entity, that everything is connected. It sees no separation between entities. Although it can see different entities, it sees what they all have in common in a complete way. So as far as the soul sees, there's a certain unity of entities. That's not true of the body. So the difference in the body and the soul is that these are two lenses, and they present the universe that God created to the Zulosoi in a way where the body presents the universe of the Zulosoi, the environment of the Zulosoi or reality, as a network of entities that are multiple, that are multiplicity. The soul presents all entities that it views as an organism, as attached to each other and part of each other. So that's a complete division in the way a body and a soul see the reality. It has a completely different sense of reality. And of course, the soul possesses a reality which is called spiritual. And therefore, it sees the innermost aspect of reality. The body sees an outer aspect of reality because it sees everything as separated. Now, Adam Rishon was given a choice because the soul and the body share a consciousness. The awareness exists in the soul and it exists in the body. So they share consciousness, but they present consciousness with two possibilities. They present reality with two possibilities. The body sees reality composing of different entities and multiple entities. The soul sees reality as an organism. It sees where everything is connected. It has a completely different view of reality. And these are two possible awarenesses which exist in the Zolosai. Zolosai has free will to choose. It has free will to choose exactly the true nature of reality. Is it multiple or is it organismic? Now, Adam Rishon was created to make this choice so that his soul and body, through it's both the common awareness that they have, should make a decision in terms of what the nature of reality is, number one, and its relationship to God. So the soul sees reality as really an organism that's all connected, and it's related to God totally in the sense that God is the creator of that reality. The body sees reality in a different way. It sees reality as a series of multiple entities, being fundamentally unrelated in vision. It does not see any sign of God or anything at all. But the soul understands the notion of God and it views God as the ultimate creator. So the region was fundamentally given these two constituents to determine the nature of reality itself and entities and the relationship to God. Now what happened? The situation was created for other Mauritians to be tested and challenged in terms of which one is true of reality. Is it organismic? Is it organismic, or is it separate, or is it multiple? This was a challenge to the awareness of other Mauritian. And of course, he was supposed to choose the view of the soul. But instead he chose the view of the body. So because of that, the history of the world changed drastically. Because he chose the view of the body over the soul, and the eight and the eight Sadas told the law, suddenly his destiny changed. The stage in which he was supposed to make the choice with his body and soul in combination changed. So suddenly something drastic happened. According to the attribute of justice, because he made the body superior to the soul, he should have been annihilated, because that's creating a complete falsity on the truth of what it really is and the truth of God. Because God is the creator of all reality. And by viewing reality according to the body, that God is totally invisible in that reality and it cannot be seen, which caters to a certain type of heresy and so on, really distinguish itself by demanding annihilation. And that's the consequence of the sin. The view of the soul, that is all an organism created by God, was a specific view of observing the commandment, was given to other Mauritian to determine the presence and the action of God in creating it all. So other Mauritian made the wrong choice, and according to the attribute of justice, other Mauritian was supposed to be annihilated. Instead, what was dominant was the attribute of mercy, and the attribute of mercy saved the life of other Mauritian. But how did it exactly save? Well, what it did, it introduced a certain concept, the concept of death. Now, the way we all understand death usually is that the soul and the body were fundamentally connected. And they were connected in terms of being part of one system. But at death is a situation where the body and the soul become disconnected. Because other Mauritians through a sin chose the body as opposed to the soul. Therefore, it brought the soul and the body almost to a state of disconnection. They were still connected, but only at their edge. If the soul and the body represents two circles, the two circles, they touch each other just at the circumference, but that's it. But they were separated fundamentally from being coincidence, where fundamentally they went through each other. So the way we see death is that the body and the soul no longer went through each other, but they touched each other in that sense, and therefore their connection was very flimsy. Well, why did this happen? Because we have to understand the reality of death. The reality of death wasn't simply the separation, the almost separation of body and soul. That's not the true reality of death. The reality of death was that suddenly the Tahara, which was the representation of Namdik Sufa, suddenly was supposed to be annihilated. Instead, God saved the other Mauritian because he took the action of the sin which was simply a choice. At the beginning, a sin was really a choice, just like a mitzvah is. And what would happen? That choice would undergo a certain zichuch. What exactly is zichuch? Zichuch is, if a person does the mitzvah, then what happens is the soul gets a certain power, and with that power, it changes or transforms the nature of the body. It purifies the body, so that the body no longer sees the reality of multiplicity. The body suddenly becomes aware of the unity and the organismic nature reality. It still retains slightly the itself, which is the essence of the Zulosoi. The fact that he is in itself, he is a single being, an individual being, capable of seeing anything outside of it. But if Adam Arishan had done the mitzvah, then the body would have become completely purified of the Yetzirah. And the Yetzirah of Adam Arishan would have disappeared. He would have established in a certain state of devakus, of an intense love of God. And then that level of devakus, that condition of devakus, would have become permanent for the body. And then it would have gone into a certain state called nitzchias, which represents eternity. Eternity really is a condition of existence, or manifestation rather, which is outside of time and outside of space. Why is that? Because it's no longer necessary. Time is only required to enact change, and change is required to deal with the consequences of a choice. So if you're given a choice of two different types of behaviors, then you need time. You need a past, present, and future, so that what you choose is present, and then it becomes the past, and future challenges lie ahead of time. So time is only really required to allow action to take place, and the action is some kind of representation or symbolic of a representation, where it represents a certain choice. So therefore, Olam Haba is said to be a state of Gemul, consequence. Gemul means consequence. And the consequence of a mitzvah is that the nature of reality would go from multiplicity to organismic, and that would be Olam Haba. So that the reality of the Zulosoi goes outside of time. Time no longer be an essential element of reality. And we call that state Olam Haba, or eternity. The Hebrew word that refers to Olam Haba is Gemul. That would have been the consequence if Adam Rishon did the mitzvah. But since Adam Rishon did the sin, he created a domination of the body over the soul, which should have resulted, according to the attribute of justice, that should have resulted in annihilation. Instead, what God did was a certain strategy, which is quite really amazing. What he did was, he gave the action of Adam Rishon, the choice, which should have remained a choice, that should have integrated in the soul of Adam Rishon. And therefore, what that would have done is, it would cancel the manifestation of the body. But instead of this, what God actuated was the attribute of mercy. And what that did, it made the choice of a sin, the choice to defy God, the choice to reject God, into an entity. So you have to think about this, what this means. Originally, a sin was a choice. It was in the mind of the Zulosoi to choose a certain option. And that option then somehow would become the dominant situation of the soul or the body. But instead, the action of a sin produced a new entity, a malach, an angel, which actually represented the actual choice itself. In other words, the choice of a sin by Adam Rishon became the consciousness of this malach. So whereas a sin before he sinned was simply a choice, after the sin, it became an entity represented by a malach. And the goal of this entity was to compete with God, because this entity called the Malach HaChavolah was an entity which had a limited perception of who God was. It's the only angel that sees God differently than an angel, all other angels. All angels clearly see the reality of God and the sovereignty and power of God. But the Malach HaChavolah does not see God this way. He sees God as a supreme entity, but he feels about himself as being an entity that it could contain eternity. So therefore, in his eternity, the Malach HaChavolah would become God. So in other words, he saw God as a competition between him and God in terms of who would become the dominant power in reality. So in actuality, this Malach had a consciousness where it could become a God. How? By absorbing the sin of the soul, the power. He would absorb the power of the neshama related to that sin. And this power would go to him. And through this power, he would obtain the kedusha necessary for him to become eternal. So therefore, this action called a sin was no longer a choice, but really was an entity that was able to rebel against God, and eventually, if it could take the kedusha of the soul for itself, it would begin to have the power to become a divine being and compete with God. Why did God do this? Why did God make the choice of a sin into a malach? Well, because the goal of that malach will become different than the goal of the choice. The goal of the choice is to be annihilated, whereas the goal of the malach is not to be annihilated, but it's to become eternal. So with this goal in mind, the Malach HaChavolah does not want to annihilate the person. What he wants to do is to absorb his energy connected to his soul. That's called a predator. And the predatory relationship was established between the sin and the zulosai. This is where predation occurs. This is where predation, the one thing eats another thing, originated. The first time that predation entered the world, entered reality, was in the Malach HaChavolah. And therefore, animals after that became certain number of animals, and after that absorbed that purpose. It predates. It eats another animal and absorbs its flesh. Spiritually, this is represented by the action of the Malach HaChavolah. It wants to eat a piece of the soul and absorb it. And by absorbing it, it would gradually develop the power to be a divine being. So because it changed its goal from annihilation to predation, that changes the whole picture. When the goal was annihilation, this is sponsored by the attribute of justice, the whole Zulosa would have been annihilated along with all of creation. But now by changing the goal, rather from annihilation to predation, the Malach wants to absorb in its being the spiritual power of the soul, and thereby being possible to obtain eternal existence. So therefore, the Malach HaChavolah does not become a Malach of what? Of annihilation. It becomes a Malach of death. And death means that it's the absorption of a certain chelik, of a certain portion of the soul. which corresponds to the sin, so that the malach, having absorbed this energy, can obtain a certain level of eternity. So the malach Avodah, by making the sin from a choice into an entity, he changed the entire motive of the malach towards the Zulosai. He doesn't want to annihilate the Zulosai. He sees the Zulosai as food, as providing this resource, the energy, to become eternal. So this fundamentally saves the Zulosai from annihilation. So this phenomena of predation by a malach is called death. And what it results in is a separation. It's a separation of the body and the soul down to its edge, its circumference in a way, the edge of two circles. Now, once this happens, there's a very serious consequence. Because if I ask you a question, what's the difference between the soul and body of Adam Rishon before the sin? In other words, when he had the possibility of choosing either direction, and after the sin, what would you say? What is different between before the sin and after the sin? Now that the sin becomes an entity of a malach, what exactly happens? Well, it's a profound thing that happens that we have to speak about. Once the malach Avodah is created from being an entity of the sin, suddenly something becomes impossible. In other words, if Adam Rishon had done the mitzvah and not eaten from the Eitz Hadas overall, he would have acquired a condition called Olam Haba. In a state where he has the choice, this state is called Olam Hazeh. And the function of Olam Hazeh, or this world, is really the function of a challenge. It represents a circumstance where he had a challenge to choose which option represents his relationship with God. So this is called, its function is called the Avodah. So the fundamental function of Olam Hazeh is to provide a circumstance where through a choice followed by an action, Adam Rishon can choose and be challenged by what the nature of reality is. Therefore, its function is Avodah, to accept the challenge and to work through it. But Olam Haba, which would have been the consequence of the choice, was suddenly by doing a mitzvah, he would acquire Olam Haba, is called a situation not of Avodah, but a situation of Gemul. It's a situation where now he deals with the consequence of his actions. So Olam Hazeh represents the concept of what? Of Avodah, accepting the challenge, the option of choice. And Olam Haba, the future world, represents the consequence of that choice. So Olam Haba either represents, according to the attribute of justice, it represents either eternity, mitzvahs, if you would have done the choice of a mitzvah, or it represents the concept of annihilation, if you would have done the sin. But both consequences are aspects of consequences. They have nothing to do with the Avodah, which is done in Olam Hazeh. That's what Chazal mean. That the difference between Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba is Olam Hazeh is where you do the work, where you accept the challenge, and Olam Haba is the place where you deal with the consequence or the gemol. After Adam Rishon sinned, and death represented the almost separation of body and soul, the soul was no longer able to do gemul. In other words, it could never dominate in its condition the body, and the two must remain separate. But that's the whole purpose of God creating the soul and the body, that fundamentally the soul would eventually dominate and purify the body so that the body can go into Olam Haba. But this now became impossible. Why? What did this? What changed the nature of Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba that it could not offer this consequence of Gamor? In other words, the soul was stuck. It was stuck with the body at the edge of both circles. All it could do was touch the body. It could no longer transform the body to become pure. It could no longer get rid of it could no longer get rid of this malach, hachavola. So the action of zichuch, which means where the soul purifies the body, could no longer take place. So we therefore see the major consequence of the sin. Because even though Adam Rishon was saved, because the sin was made into an entity, a separate entity, but the sin could not be annihilated as such. And the body could not be purified to be able to enter Olam Haba. So the fundamental task of zichuch, of purification, could not be done by the soul. And the body was stuck in this condition where the sin of Adam Rishon was represented by an entity, the angel of destruction. Why did God do this? Well, he allowed, first of all, the sin to be destroyed as the entity. How? Well, this I'll have to discuss at a different time. But the fundamental fact is this, is when the Malach Havola suddenly absorbs some of the energy of the soul, because now the Malach Havola is the entity of the sin itself. It has the awareness of the sin. And if it succeeds and begins to absorb the power of the soul, it suddenly disappears. And this is its end. In other words, by the Malach Havola, the angel of destruction, absorbing some of the entity, some of the rather the energy of the soul, it commits suicide. Why? Because it cannot become real. You cannot become a competitor to God. You are not God's twin, and you cannot be another God besides the real one. And the mere attempt to do that is that when you are successful and you have acquired new energy through your predation, through the process of predatory being, you disappear. You are annihilated. So the conversion of the choice of the sin into an entity called an angel, the Malach Havola, angel of destruction, is assured annihilation not of the Zolasoi, but of the sin of the Zolasoi. So therefore, the sin disappears. But does the soul retain its ability then after the disappearance of the Malach Havola, to purify the body? Not really. Because now you are on a certain stage of creation. Because God, in order to create this situation where the sin, which is a choice, becomes an entity, he changed the laws of the universe. And the laws of the universe now cannot perform zichuch. The soul cannot mezachech the guf. It cannot purify the body. So the question then, so how is it restored to the soul? Because Olam Haba cannot ensue unless the soul retains or its ability is restored to mezachech the guf, to purify the body. The question is, how is this done? Because once Adam Rishon, certain things happened. It was the beginning of human history. And well, what do you mean by the beginning of human history? One of the immediate effects of the sin of Adam Rishon is whereas Adam Rishon was the only man, the only form of the Zolotzoi that God created, he contained the souls of everyone in human history into himself. All of mankind was nothing more than the mind of Adam Rishon in a unified form. There were no other species. In other words, mankind was not a species. It was an individual, Adam Rishon. And he could have earned all of Olam Haba in one time. But after the sin, mankind became a species. Adam Rishon turned into mankind, and from one man became all of humanity that will be distributed throughout history with the same option. It would not be, in this case, the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It would be mitzvahs. So if mankind chose certain mitzvahs to do them, he could then eventually, with the disappearance of Zorma, he would be able to mazaker his guf. But this now was a challenge for mankind. What was formerly the challenge for Adam Rishon as a single entity became a challenge of mankind, where every man, every person of the species called mankind, or the Min Enushi, now had the same task of transforming reality from a condition of Avodah to a condition of Gemul, or consequence. So therefore, mankind will now have to go through history. Each individual will have to make his own choice and determine his own consequence. But death is not simply a condition where the sin becomes an entity. It represents a universe. It represents a certain darkness. Because with the sin becoming an entity itself, mankind now not simply had a Yetzirah where he saw himself outside of God. And it was a misconception. It was a distortion of the presence of God. Whereas before, he had to choose between whether or not he was part of God, or rather God was separate from him, and of a dual nature. He now also believed, with the consciousness of the sin, he actually believed that he had power. That's why the Torah says, Kokri v'yatzum yadi, that I have now power to do things. So the evil impulse was exacerbated, it was exaggerated, and became much more powerful. So the sins of mankind became more intense. So therefore, human history changed. Now, the world of Avodah, which is Olam Hazeh, became more intensely involved in darkness. Because not only was there an evil thought of being outside of God, but that being outside of God gave man a certain power to do things, so that his actions had certain results. So therefore, the evil that man created was worse after the sin than before the sin. The Yetzirah after the sin was much more powerful and much more broad, in the sense that man had the illusion not only that he was outside of God and God was outside of him, but he had the illusion that he actually has power to affect reality in a certain way according to his desires. So the evil impulse became much more stronger. So the situation of the Avodah became much greater. His task and his choice became much greater. So therefore, the world of death is very different than the world of Adam Rishon before the sin. It represented a whole new reality. And at death itself, when death finally occurs, and the soul leaves the body, the soul then goes to a new reality. But in a certain sense, this reality called the Zorma Vernachash, this is called Zorma. This reality of Zorma, which is the contamination of death and the contamination of the body, now believes, now goes to a place which suddenly can perform the act of rehabilitation. In other words, there was no such thing as rehabilitation by the attribute of justice. Mankind either did its sin and was annihilated, or did the mitzvah and he was eternalized. But after the Zorma came into the world, which is the identification of the sin, the world now was filled with Zorma. So even the spiritual world of the soul itself was contaminated by the angels of destruction. In other words, death was a creation that put choice as an entity called the angels of destruction. And they also ruled the universe, both physical and spiritual. That's right. Even the spiritual universe of the soul was now under the domination of the Zorma of the Nachash. So even though the person died and left the body was intact and but it was buried in the ground. But the soul itself carried the Zorma of the Nachash also. So therefore, it had to be rehabilitated. How would this rehabilitation take place? So we see an amazing difference between before the sin and after the sin. Before the sin, the world was a combination of body and soul, spiritual and physical. After the sin, everything became what? Became contaminated through Zorma. Zorma stretched from one end of creation to the other end. So even though the body disintegrated in the ground and lost its Zorma upon disintegration, the soul now also had to relieve itself of its contamination. And how would it do that? Well, a special place was created called Gehenna. And Gehenna was a place in the spiritual world which could remove the Zorma that now lay on it because of the sin. So Gehenna is a special institution which in a certain sense forces the soul to recommit all the sins that it did in life. And as it recommitted these sins, as it did these sins in the spiritual sense, it's in a lot of pain. So Gehenna is nothing more than the repetition of the sins that the person did in life in the spiritual world. But in the spiritual world, you actually see the full ramifications of a sin. And this causes pain. And the pain resolves the sin from appearing. It heals the sin. And the contamination, the Zorma, which sits on the soul, disappears. So just like the body goes into the ground and dies and disintegrates, just like the body loses its Zorma upon disintegration by losing its form, the soul loses its Zorma by entering a spiritual state of called Gehenna. So therefore, suddenly the spiritual world itself, as its own world, was involved in the process of what? Of Tahara, purification. So what happened is that the whole world itself, the physical and spiritual world, now was no longer involved in a process called zichuch, which means that the body is purified so that the soul can become eternal with the body in Olam Haba, but the entire world was now occupied with a different process, which is called rehabilitation, the removal of the Zorma which entered the world when sin became an entity, when sin became the Malachei HaKabbalah. Very important thing to know. that the consequences of the sin of Adam Rishon became a consequence where now the entire universe, both spiritual and physical, were involved in a new process called rehabilitation. So this was the result of death, both the body in its own way, through death, through disintegration of itself, and the soul in itself, both obtain Tahara, or purification. And how does it do that? It does that by entering an area called Gehenna to do that. And what happens to the body after it enters Gehenna? Well, after a certain amount of time, it stays there, performs what it has to do, and eliminates its Zorma. And from there, the soul goes to a place called Gan Eden, which is a world of souls. And Gan Eden is really, and I'll speak about this again, but Gan Eden is a place where a soul exists fundamentally, somewhat detached from the body. Because even though the body is in the ground disintegrating, the soul is still connected at the edge. But the question really is, what does that mean it's connected at the edge? Is the soul merely connected at the edge of the body, or something else happens? And I believe that something completely different happens. And Zorma is not a circumstance where the body just touches the soul at the edge. But actually the two are really connected together, just like they were before. But Zorma is actually a circumstance where a certain contamination of the evil choice that it made actually covers the body, it covers the soul. So therefore, it's not that the soul and the body separate, but actually what happens is that the body covers the soul in a certain way. Well, I should say not the body, but the Zorma of the body covers the soul. So now what you have is a new state. You have a state of a soul being spiritual, being fundamentally covered by Zorma. So therefore, the connection between the body and soul is no longer really visible. It appears that the two are distinct. It appears that the two are separated. But this is only an illusion. The two are as connected as they were before the sin of Adam Rishon. Even before, the soul and the body were connected, and they were both connected to one level of awareness. That remains. But because of the Zorma now infiltrating the soul and the body, it covers the whole awareness concept. So it appears like the two have two different levels of awareness. So the awareness of the body is lying in the ground in death, and the awareness of the soul now is in a place called Gehenna or a place called Gan Eden. But it's a new type of awareness, much lower than the awareness of the soul that had an awareness before the sin. So therefore, what death really is the acquisition of a new type of awareness. And the body and the soul think that they are now separated. But this is an illusion. They are not separated. Both still share the same awareness, but they feel, because Zorma is like a cover, a coat that you put on which hides the body. When you wear a coat, you actually don't look the same anymore. You see the presence of the coat, not the presence of the body. So it appears like the body disappeared. But what really happens, it's simply covered. It's hidden. So the soul and the body think that they have separated. It just thinks that. But in actuality, it hasn't separated, but it now put on a new piece of apparel called a coat, which hides the body from the soul. And that's what really is. Gehenna and Gan Eden are not real places. They are not separate spiritual places, devoid of physicality. They are still connected to physicality. That's right. The neshama is still connected to physicality. But it appears to the soul in its awareness that its physicality was compromised and it feels like it's separated. So therefore what goes on is there are two realities. There's the reality of the body and the soul in their unified form. In actuality, they are still connected. But there's the perception or the cognition of it that it appears to the body and soul like they're separated. And that's what Zorma does. Zorma does not separate the physical and the spiritual. It does not. The two remain together. But I believe that what Zorma does, is create a cover on the physical body affecting the soul so that they both think, they both feel that they are now almost completely separated. So therefore, in a certain sense, in reality, Gehenna is somewhat physical, and Gan Eden is somewhat physical. There's a remnant of physicality clearly denoting the unification of the body and soul in reality. But the appearance is that the Gehenna and Gan Eden are purely spiritual places. They're called the world of souls. But this is only an appearance. It's not a truth. In any case, we see the major effect, what has happened. That before, the position of Adam in what? The position of Adam before the sin was what? Was a process called Avodah, where he had to make a choice. After the sin, the process of Avodah became even more direct. Now there was a new Avodah, whereas before the Avodah was to purify the body so that the body could now go into Olam Haba. Now the purification was an act of cleansing the body. The body had to be cleaned, not elevated. The body could not be elevated to Zichur before it was cleaned. And this process is called Tahara. So this is what it means. Tahara is a process of cleansing, perfect cleansing, which removes any form of contamination. And Olam Hazeh, the physical world and the spiritual world, which were still connected, now participate in this process called Tahara. What happens after the Tahara? What happens then? What happens after the soul goes what? Goes to Gehenna and establishes a cleansing, a state of Tahara. It then goes to Gan Eden, where it has to wait. Wait for what? Well, it has to wait to return. It has to wait for return back to the physical world. Why? Because if it does not return, if the soul does not return to the physical world and the Zoma disappears, you cannot have the process of Zichur. In other words, Zichur is a process of transformation. It's where the body and the soul transform together into a condition called Olam Haba. If Zichur cannot take place, you cannot have Olam Haba. So therefore what happens is the expansion of the process of Olam Hazeh, this world. This world becomes a process not simply of Avodah, where man has to choose between the Yetzirah and the Yetzer Tov, but it becomes a process to some extent of a certain Gemur. Originally, the physical universe was only a place where the process was central to choosing between the Yetzirah and the Yetzer Tov, between the evil and the positive inclination. But now, because of the presence of Zorma, representing the existence of a sin, Olam Hazeh takes on a new role. It takes on a role where fundamentally the Zohar has to be eradicated. Not the soul or the body, but the Zohar has to be eradicated. And that's called the process of Tahara. So the process where Zohar is eradicated is called Tahara. The process where the body and the soul are transformed into a new condition called eternity, that's called Zichuch. So there's a very big difference between Tahara and Zichuch, which is a process of Kedusha. So when it uses these two verbs in prayers, where it says, these two mean different things. Tahara, purification, refers to a cleansing process of the removal of Zohar, which was the new state of what a sin was. Kedusha represents holiness, which means the ascendancy, where the body and soul go to a new level together in Olam Haba. So therefore, what happened after the sin was that Olam Hazeh took on a new role. Not only did it have a role where it fundamentally challenged Adam Rishon to do a mitzvah and make a choice, but it took on the role that if he made the wrong choice and did a sin, that he would not be annihilated, but that would be the place where the Zohar eventually would be purified or cleansed, which is really a process of Gemul, because it represents a process of consequence. So therefore, Olam Hazeh, the physical world as we know it, which incorporates the soul, also became involved in a consequence, producing a consequence. Initially, Olam Hazeh was only supposed to be a place which allowed the choice and the challenge of transforming the body and soul into a place called Olam Haba, eternity, where time would and substance would disappear, and space. But this process changed because of the introduction of a new thing called the entity of Zohar, or the entity where a malach represented the sin itself. Now a new function was instituted in Olam Hazeh. Not a process of Avodah, but a process of Gemul, consequence. But the consequence was the annihilation of Zohar, the production and the annihilation of Zohar. So therefore, there was an expansion of Olam Hazeh. The net result of the sin of Adam Rishon expanded the concept of physicality, the physical world, which incorporated the physical body and the spiritual soul. Because now, instead of being able to mazachis the Bria, to transform the Bria into Olam Haba, the process of what? Of consequence, it now had to deal with Olam Hazeh. It had to rectify the Zohar in Olam Hazeh itself. So therefore, Olam Hazeh took on a new role. It took on a role of consequence as well as Avodah, a service, challenge. Now this whole process stops. It does. Where Olam Hazeh returns, and therefore it then assumes, or I should say resume, Zichuch. After Tchias HaMesim, which is the resurrection of the dead, the Zohar, which was on the body and on the soul, disappears completely, and the sin is annihilated, leaving the soul and body in a new state. And in this new state, the soul can now transform the body so that both go to Olam Haba. So it's only after Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of dead, where the two are put together again in total unity, just like they were before the sin, the soul and the body. And the possibility now is resumed that the soul purifies the body, and then the body can also go to Olam Haba with the soul. So we see the result of the sin of Adam Rishon was a delay. A delay. that initially Olam Hazeh was a process of Avodah, to do the challenge of making a choice, and that was the process of what you call Olam Hazeh. That was a singular task, and Olam Haba was a process of consequence, eternity. Eternity will be created in Olam Haba, but now, because of the sin, Olam Hazeh became much more powerful. First, you had to remove Zohar. Then you can resume the process of consequence, which is Zichur Haguf. So since the resurrection of the dead represents the cancellation of Zohar and the cancellation of the hidden aspect of body and soul, now you could clearly see the union of body and soul, which you couldn't see when Zohar was on top of the body and soul and hid the connection between the two. So the presence of Zohar had to be eliminated. That's right. The presence of Zohar had to be eliminated so that suddenly the union of the body and soul became visible and clear. And the soul can then suddenly, it can cause the body to ascend in level and purify it to a very high spiritual level, where suddenly the body and the soul can both together become eternal. So therefore we see certain consequences. First of all, we see the consequence, the concept of function. That the function of Olam Hazeh before the sin was simply a function of choosing. And the function of consequence was a function that was obtained by what's called Olam Haba. After the sin, the function of Avodah, still choosing the sin, remained, but at the same time, a new function was created, a function which really belonged to Olam Haba, because suffering is a form of annihilation. It's a form of annihilation where you suffer a lot of pain, and it's as if you are annihilated. And the world of consequence really only belongs to Olam Haba. Olam Haba is a world of consequence, where according to the attribute of justice, you are either annihilated or you become eternal. But that's a consequence, and that belongs in Olam Haba. But after the sin of Adam Rishon, because of the attribute of mercy, Olam Hazeh, this world became more intensely involved, because it not only became a place of choosing to do the rest of the mitzvahs, the Tahara mitzvahs, the 630 mitzvahs given at Sinai, because it also became a world of consequence. And the consequence was to cleanse the world of Zohar. So Zohar represented a delay. It gave an added process. Of cleansing to the original process of choosing. So now Olam Hazeh is preoccupied with choosing and cleansing. Choosing between a sin and a mitzvah, and cleansing yourself from Zohar if you created it. And then subsequently, Olam Haba became a world of pure consequence, where you will gradually reach, through Zichur, you will reach eternity. So we see clearly the distinction between Adam Rishon before the sin and Adam Rishon after the sin, with the introduction of death. Because what was introduced was not only death, which represented the cleansing of the body of Zohar, but the cleansing of the soul of Zohar through Gehenna, and so to some degree in Gan Eden. Even though there's no suffering in Gan Eden at all, we will discuss next time this very powerful concept that even in Gan Eden there's a form of suffering. That's right. Most people have no idea that the presence of the soul in Gan Eden, after it cleanses itself from Zohar on the soul, is still a form of suffering, and is still dominated to a certain extent by the world of Zohar. How is that possible? How could the world of Zorma still exist at some level, on some way, it somehow still has dominion? As long as the body and the soul appear to be separate, Zorma has dominion. But we need to understand exactly what that concept is. And we need to understand also why the body and the soul must always be together. Fundamentally, the body and the soul cannot separate. They must always remain together. And we need to understand why. Why can't they separate? Why can't new things come into picture where they now separate and come together? Why must they be always connected to each other? And that somehow has to do with the nature of the body and the nature of the soul, which we will discuss next time. So what I've given today is an overview, a complete overview of the sin of Rehabilitation, the consequence, what death is, and how death leaves, comes and goes. And finally, how we restore the entire situation after the resurrection of the dead to be like Rehabilitation, like Rehabilitation before he sinned. Except something new changes. After the resurrection of the dead, you no longer deal with the concept of sins and mitzvahs. That consequence almost disappears. And we have to discuss that next time also. Okay, so that's the shir. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the in previous shirim used to have a mushal of two circles that would overlap the body circle and the soul circle. There's a little overlap
that's before
there.
The sin.
Then
because the two worlds would...
Yeah.
Yes.
We used to say that death was when they almost separated, just a little teensy bit. They were still touching. Now, are we revising that to?
Yes.
We don't.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. I'm revising that. In other words, I think that this is only a perception, but I think the reality is that the two worlds of the soul and the body still overlap exactly as they did before. I choose the option to say what really goes on, it seems to be only an apparent separation, but not real. Because in truth, the two must remain together all the time. The only difference is now they are completely overwhelmed by Zorma. So when you look at them, it's like a man wearing a coat. When you see a man with a coat on, you don't see his suit. You see his coat. So the coat gives the impression as if the suit disappeared. And that's what happens. So that is a revision.
Are we revising the earlier stage where the two circles were almost completely covering, like
yes,
in the same place?
The answer to
as
that,
well?
Yes. It's not as well. That's exactly what I'm doing.
So the circles never changed, even from Adam Arisha and Kodem Achet to after Achet. Those circles are still in the same place.
Right, exactly. Except that they don't look like it. They do not look like they appear in the same place, but they are exactly in the same place, only appearing as if they separated because of the presence of Zorma. Zorma, like I said, is like a coat on top of a suit. When you have a coat on, you can no longer see the suit. So it looks like there's no more suit, but that's not true. The suit is underneath the coat. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, very good. Okay, thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rob.
Take care.